So in this week's class, we're going to be looking at social influence on voting. And there's two different types of things we can look at. We can look at first vote choices. That is, do you select usually the Republican candidate or the Democratic candidate in the United States, obviously. In different other countries, you have different parties. And in local elections, there might not be any party at all. So essentially, can we show that your social network influences which candidate you ultimately vote for? Um, but there's multiple options in any election, right? You could vote for in the U.S. You could vote for the Democratic candidate. You could vote for the Republican candidate. You could vote for a third-party candidate, or, and this is a very common choice, you could stay home and not vote, right? In local elections, that might be the most common choice. That you just don't vote for any of the candidates, right? So, and that can be influenced by social networks too, right? So we can look at social network influence on vote decisions. We can look at social network choices on turnout decisions, whether or not you actually turn out to vote. So in this video lecture, we're going to look at vote decisions, and we're actually going to talk about why it's so hard to actually demonstrate that there's any social influence on vote choices. And then there's another video. In that video lecture, it will look at different models of social influence on turnout. Okay, so let's start with what evidence there might be for social influence in voting. And one way we might look at this is to look at aggregate evidence. We hear a lot of we've heard a lot in the last decade, actually more like 15, 20 years or so, of red states and blue states. Red states are those states in which the vast majority of people are Republican, and blue states are those states in which the vast majority of people are Democrats. And this is a large exaggeration. Right, so you take Texas, and Texas is one of the sort of red states, and even when it's at its most reddest, with overwhelming Republican votes, there's still more Democrats in Texas than in a state like Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is one of the most blue, most Democratic states. These are very large places with diverse populations, and so if you have millions of people and only 25% of them are Democrats, that's still a lot of people who are Democrats. Just imagine, right, a state with 12 million people and a quarter of them are Democrats. That means you have 3 million Democrats in that state. So there are a lot of red states and blue states, but another thought is that there are red neighborhoods and blue neighborhoods, right, in the neighborhood in which most people vote Republican or most people vote Democratic. Okay, and we might think that if everybody in the neighborhood or county or state votes the same way, then perhaps we're showing evidence of social influence, that people are conforming to the people around them, right? So if we just say, oh, look, you have these areas where a lot of people are voting for the same candidates, they must be influencing each other. That might be some sort of evidence of social influence. The problem with that is something that is known as the ecological fallacy. And the ecological fallacy is what happens when we use aggregate data to make incorrect inferences about individual behavior. That is, we take the sum of opinions, that is, we take what's ever happening in a neighborhood or a county or in a state and saying, the individuals in the county, neighborhood, or state behave in a particular way because of that aggregate data, okay? And maybe this is true, but maybe it's not true. The classic example of the ecological fallacy is not about social influence at all, but it's about the 1968 presidential election. In 1968, you had Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic candidate for president, the current vice president of the United States. You had Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate for president, the former vice president of the United States. And so normally that would be your election, the Democratic versus the Republicans. But that year you also had George Wallace. George Wallace was a Democrat. He was governor of Alabama, and he was running a third-party candidacy. And what you'd find is that if we broke up the vote decisions by race, that is, if we look at the counties that have the fewest African Americans, what we find is that in those counties that have almost no African Americans, basically nobody voted for George Wallace. And in counties in which you had a lot of African Americans, a lot of people voted for George Wallace. That's where George Wallace was getting his almost a lot of his votes, right? So that would indicate, it would seem, that if as the African American population in the county goes up, the vote for Wallace goes up, that would seem to suggest that, well, maybe African Americans are voting for George Wallace. But let's listen to George Wallace for just 1 second. Some of his thoughts, and some of his thoughts on race.
In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
So here's the problem. George Wallace did best where there were more African Americans because white people in those areas were more likely to vote for Wallace. The power of white people in those areas where there was a large African American population was challenged when African Americans got more power, right? If you were in an area that was almost exclusively white, and there was a small black population, and that population got some more rights and more access to policy making, if the area was still 95% white, well, then the white power wasn't challenged at all. There was no reason to vote for the segregationists, no reason to vote for the person who opposed civil rights for African Americans. Okay? So the aggregate data makes it look like one thing is happening at an individual level, but a completely different thing is happening. So as a general rule, when we're trying to show influence effects, we don't want aggregate data. We want individual, or even better, network level data. Okay? So if we had network level data, we might find that someone who is in a social network with members of one party votes for that party. Maybe that's evidence of social influence, right? So if you have a person and they vote Republican and everyone around them votes Republican, maybe that means that we're having some social influence, some evidence that social influence is taking place. Okay, so let's take this individual, and let's say this individual is a Republican voter according to our survey, and we ask them, who do you talk to about politics? And we find that they have these two friends, and those two friends are Republican voters. Then we might say, well, okay, the reason this person voted Republican is because they were influenced by their Republican friends. And maybe they'll tell us that, really what happens is I don't give them information about politics, they give me information about politics, and so we can be fairly certain that's the direction the influence is taking place. On the other hand, we might find out who are some people who you work with whom you don't talk about politics. And we find out there are these two people that she works with and they vote Democratic, right? Well, now is this really social influence that's taking place, or is it a selection process? She is a Republican, so she chooses Republican friends, right? And so they all reinforce one another and they vote Republican, right? She has these Democrats who she works with who she could be friends with, but she doesn't talk to them. So there's no actual social influence taking place. It's homophily. Homophily is what's occurring, and that homophily makes it look like social influence is taking place. Okay, but maybe we could get better data, but we'd still have another problem, and that problem would be, what do we mean by influence or persuasion? What does it mean to show influence or to show persuasion? So let's imagine that we have the same 5 people, but this time they're all connected with our target individual. And let's say in August, 3 months prior to the election, we asked our target person, who are you voting for? And she says, well, I don't know. And then we find on election day she voted for the Republican. Right? Well, what we can say is perhaps she talked with her Democratic friends, and she talked with her Republican friends, and she found the Republican friends to be more persuasive. So she voted Republican. Okay? That might make sense, and that shows evidence of social influence, and that can occur. But there is a more likely scenario. The more likely scenario is that in August, 3 months prior to the election, she tells us, well, I'm probably going to vote Republican. Maybe not necessarily, maybe not definitely I'm going to vote Republican, but I'm probably going to vote Republican. She probably has some vote choice, right? She is a partisan. She has a partisanship. She has some partisan beliefs, some partisan attachment, okay? And as a general rule, people vote for the candidate from their party, so she probably thinks, since I'm a Republican, I'm going to vote Republican. And then on election day, lo and behold, we see she voted Republican. That doesn't necessarily show much influence. Now, it could be the case that her Republican friends kept her from switching to the Democratic Party, but we actually have no evidence of that. We can't show that's what's happening. Okay, and so even in this simple 5-person network, it might be difficult to actually show social influence. But there is yet another complication, another reason things could become more difficult. So let's imagine that we have this 5-person social network, and let's imagine that there's a thing called the news media, which of course there is, and let's imagine that this person pays attention to the news media, so she gets information from the news media. Well, in that case, it could be that she listened to the Democrats and she listened to the Republicans and she found the Republican messages to be more persuasive, and that's why she voted Republican. Or it could be that she watched the news and listened to what was happening on the news, and she thought the information that was located there was more persuasive, and that's why she voted Republican. We haven't even considered she might watch political ads and find those ads to be more persuasive, and that's why she voted Republican, right? So it's possible that there's social influence taking place in this case, but we have no way of proving that. So what do we need to show social influence? We need individual level data that provides us with people's likely vote decisions at multiple points in time, that allows us to rule out either selection as a confound, or maybe we can observe the network creation process. And so we can see that as she starts talking to more Republicans, then she's more likely to vote Republican. And before that, she wasn't voting Republican necessarily. We also need it to have the information that's coming from the social network, and then the information that she's getting that's not coming from the social network. And so we typically can't get all of this with survey data. With whole network data, we might be able to show some evidence that social influence is likely, but it still would leave open the possibility of selection. And actually, when we're talking about voters, we have a hard time getting whole network data anyway. But with experiments, like the one you're reading this week, we can show social influence is happening and how it's happening. The problem here is that we're stripping a lot of the complexities of the electoral environment, right? And so it becomes a sort of simpler model of elections. But you can imagine if we have sort of the experimental evidence plus the sort of evidence from the typical survey, we can be fairly certain that social influence is possible and it does take place. But you know what? For a lot of elections, persuasion might not be the most important thing to look at. You know, in presidential elections, most people vote for the candidate from their party almost all the time. Like 90% of the time, they'll vote for the candidate from their party. Sometimes it's even higher than 90%. That is, if they vote. In local elections, well, most people stay home. Most people don't vote in local elections. So turnout, whether you vote or not, might be the more interesting dependent variable, might be the more interesting thing to study. So the next lecture is about ways in which people might make the decision to turn out via social influence.